fantastic. Thank you guys for your time. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to this cyber judo session with Mick joining us again, talking about governance, risk, and compliance, particularly the C portion of it. And so this is part 2 of our introduction to the fundamentals of GRC and information security. So Mick, that all being said, why don't you just give us a really brief recap of part 1 that you hit on a couple of weeks ago, right? And then jump right into part 2 and share your screen for us. Cool?
Sounds good. I'll actually share the screen right now because the nice part about this little page is that I threw in key takeaways at the tops of all of these pages here. So just quick review over the whole governance side of things. Big takeaways on that were that the governance provides the organizational guidance for the operations and management of any cybersecurity program for an organization. And it's dictated largely in the policies and procedures documentation itself. The management and oversight of, actually engaging with what the policies and procedures dictate. And of course, planning of initiatives for everything moving forward, everything from testing of security plans, any engagements such as pen testing or operations like that, anything moving forward that falls under governance jurisdiction there. And overall, it just provides the level of oversight needed to actually organize and keep things moving in a forward trajectory in that front for cybersecurity there. As for governance, or as for risk, our little key takeaways there, it's just simple view is that risk is the analysis of threat that an organization faces versus the vulnerabilities the organization has. So it's the comparison of what might the organization be facing, what's actually at stake in case anything comes from these threats actually being engaging, and of course the vulnerabilities and managing how those will actually be able to access anything that's critical or important, or even just accessing things in general to the point of still functioning. So risk can actually help manage how anything happens with a DOS attack as much as it can any confidentiality or integrity situations on cybersecurity front there. And of course, all of that can go about in different ways. Risk can be tracked based on a variety of criteria, anything from your external risks from your Russian hackers targeting your very small 2-person business for whatever reason it can happen, all the way to, you have a server room in somebody's closet and you don't have a sprinkler system. Well, okay, that's an actual organizational risk, and your website can get shut down in case, you decide to have a fire in your closet there. So risk is all about managing all of that and keeping things up and running in a copacetic manner. And all of that translates into our big piece for tonight, which is compliance. Woo, the big scary thing. So when it comes to compliance, it is simply the management and consideration of rules and regulations. That is all it really is in a nutshell. But it gets very complicated the more in depth you decide to look at things. So your organization will find itself managing different levels of compliance just depending on what it's operating as, where it currently is in terms of its cybersecurity posture, what kind of money it has to throw at things. All sorts of business operations and all that go into dictating what is important for compliance. So that is essentially what I like to look at it as the overarching concept of GRC, because you can talk about, writing policies all day long. You can talk about risk management all day long, but without the compliance side, you really, don't have any standards to dictate your policies and procedures around. You also might have a bit more of a difficult time tracking your risks, figuring out what actually is at stake other than, from a general shotgun approach to whatever your organization is doing. And of course, the reasoning for everything, because if you find yourself needing to adhere to some sort of regulatory body and you don't, well, you might not be in business for very much longer from that point. So there'll be key takeaways in this compliance board as well for anybody who wants to go and take a look at this page after this whole little presentation here. But of course, we have Sobchak telling us there are rules, and that is what we are here for. So there's a lot of compliance standards. Like, you can spend easily 5 hours in a lecture talking about every single one of the standards that may or may not be relevant to you. But there's a lot of ones that are very, very granular that are like, okay, do I even need to care about that? The big thing is that I like to focus on a handful of these because working in cybersecurity, these are going to be very, very common frameworks, regulations, and standards that you will encounter. And a lot of these are a combination of your mandatory versus your voluntary standards. So all the voluntary standards in this list are notated by an asterisk. What the difference is obviously mandatory means it's mandated. Depending on whatever business operations, what kind of data, whatever you're actually doing within your organization, you have to adhere to certain standards that way. Voluntary serves as a very good sort of dual purpose system where one, it allows you to better align your cybersecurity posture with these frameworks and standards that way. So you know actually how to develop your posture from there. And two, this is the big one, it makes you look really, really good. If you have a customer who wants to see exactly how robust your cybersecurity posture is, and you say, oh, well, we are compliant with this level of the CIS control list. Well, if you're compliant with group number 3 of the list there, you're looking very, very pretty, and everybody's going to trust you with everything that they have, including their own grandma's social security number, right? So before I actually start breaking down some of these compliance standards, do we have any questions so far?
Okay, looks like no one else has any questions, but I have a quick one, Mick. And this is mostly for, because I'm so excited about this topic. I love this topic so much, and I've spoken so much about it in the past with a lot of different customers. I want to make sure that I interject myself at the right time, which is, do you cover anything talking about budgeting and planning for any compliance standards?
I not directly in the thing, but I was going to bring that up in sort of the testing element.
Excellent. Awesome. I'll let you continue. And then I want to chit chat about that at a later point in this conversation here.
You're going to explode. So I'm ready for that one.
So, I love talking about that money and compliance.
All the money is all red in the face right there. You can tell he's really here for it. So when it comes to these compliance standards, I'm going to spoil something. This is basically what your average compliance framework looks like. It is always ridiculously dense, always bogged down in the worst verbiage, and of course, the most archaic verbiage you can imagine. So that's where we get paid for doing this sort of stuff, right? We break down all of this legalese, all of these gigantic tomes of alleged knowledge, and provide that in a more actionable way for an organization to actually adhere to it. So a big thing that we talk about, especially in what I do in my day-to-day work, is dealing with HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. So that is, for the sake of keeping in a nutshell, everything related to PHI, Protected Health Information. That's everything from your name, address, phone number, contact information, all the way to whatever fun diseases you might be diagnosed with, conditions, what have you. What separates PHI from any other kind of personally identifiable information is actually how and where it is being generated and transmitted from. So for it to be classified as PHI, it actually needs to come from what is called a covered entity, which is usually a hospital, doctor's office, health insurance organization, something like that, something along those fronts that is actually transacting your information in a healthcare capacity, usually for some kind of monetary situation. So that is what separates your PHI from your PII, personally identifiable information, because you can actually say, I have diabetes on your Facebook. That's PII, because you technically don't have anything being transacted with any doctor, any covered entity. When it's published on Facebook, it's now public knowledge. You probably don't want to be doing that. But at that point, it does not actually become protected health information until some level of covered entity, some doctor's office, health insurance, what have you, actually owns and transmits some of that in some capacity. So that's where things get very, very tricky, because how do you actually propose, or how do you actually, transmit all of this PHI in a secure manner, especially when you're dealing with entities that are not covered entities, such as your business associates. Business associates is pretty much any other kind of organization that is conducting business with a covered entity in some capacity. Way you could think of that is if you have some sort of app on your phone that actually transmits messages to and from your doctor's office about anything from your prescriptions to any treatment, anything like that, then it is still transmitting PHI. And the business associate, whoever is actually operating that app or developing that app, needs to find themselves HIPAA compliant. The big reason why you want to be HIPAA compliant is, one, well, not only do you have to, but two, there are very hefty and nasty fines and penalties that come with failure to comply with that. It reaches upwards of tens of millions of dollars for massive data breaches that do occur. And so in case anybody's curious, you can pull up the little wall of shame that the Office of Civil Rights, OCR, operates. Basically, if your organization gets a data breach occurring that's a violation of HIPAA, you get to have your organization listed there along with, all the other fun minor details, such as, what exactly had happened and, what your penalty wound up being. So because of that, that often hurts a lot of brand trust. And typically, if you have a data breach with HIPAA, you want to clean that up for quite a while. And also, you get to make that not so fun public mea culpa, as you actually have to interact with covered entities whose data was exposed, as well as even some cases, individuals whose data was exposed. So now HIPAA is, again, what I largely work in day to day. And it's a very common thing that you see all around, but I will not dig too much deeper into that because A, this is an intro, and B, this is what a typical regulatory page of regulation text page of HIPAA looks like. 3 columns of just references and codes and gobbledygook that makes absolutely no sense and will make your eyes start to bleed if you look too deeply into the 300-page document that actually comes with all of these rules. So yeah, please proceed with caution.
I got one additional note about HIPAA. So anyone who's wondering, so HIPAA is not written by security folks, wasn't written by IT folks, wasn't written by medical professionals. It was written by your general, fairly litigious lawmaker types. And that started all the way back initially in 1996, right? Even with some of the new kind of addendums like Final Omnibus to HIPAA and some of the standards and requirements, the fact of the matter is that it's still fairly antiquated. And in some instances, it's a little kind of quirky to line up with newer technologies that might exist. For example, like serverless technologies, right? So how do you deal with anti-malware controls when you have a serverless environment that is leveraging something like AWS Lambdas, right? There's always a little bit of quirkiness there. And then also the handling of, protected health information versus consumer health information, which can be generated by a consumer and be sent to a provider at their own optional choice. So it gets a little bit funky because, again, the time has changed quite a bit. I did throw in a chat for everyone else here, by the way, Software Developers Guide to HIPAA Compliance that I wrote a while back, and I keep up to date every now and then. So if anyone's ever interested, or you're looking at healthcare information technology, or you're going to have to work in that field a little bit, or develop an app for any customers that are in the healthcare vertical, that's always a good one to have in your back pocket. So that being said, Mick, back over to you.
That's actually a good point to mention. So HIPAA is actually, it's split up essentially into 2 different sections within 2 sections. So while you have your covered entities and business associates that HIPAA gets applied to, all of the 180 criteria that go to the security rule, privacy rule, and breach rule, obviously those are 3 rules that are defined based on what you need to do in case of privacy monitoring and controls, security monitoring and controls, and of course, breach notifications. With all of that, these rules are wind up becoming required or addressable based on whatever the scope of the entity is performing. So now, required is usually exactly what it means, but addressable has that sort of leeway as long as there's some justification, as long as there's some level that is actually being undertaken. HIPAA is actually not as prescriptive in that regard. So you have some leeway, but you got to like really work the leeway in order to account for all of those, I'll say, shadowy bits. So, so with that, if we were going to look at another mandatory regulation thing, how about we go all the way across the pond to something horribly insane to deal with, GDPR, or the General Data Protection Regulation. The reason I'm skipping ahead to this is because this is a massive one. See, I only have a little bit here because otherwise we'll be talking about this all night long. But in a tight nutshell, GDPR is the data privacy rules that are associated with citizens of the European Union. What that means is if your organization is targeting or interacting with consumer or any kind of personal data that is coming from citizens of the EU, you have to adhere to the GDPR standards, which provides some level of, proof of protection of the data that's being collected, processes relating to what the data is actually there for. So you need to prove that you are collecting the minimum amount of data necessary for what you're doing and justify what you're doing with that data, as well as also providing the consumer, whoever you're collecting data from, the ability and the right to request that their data is deleted from your systems within a certain time frame. So the reason it's big and obtrusive and obnoxious is because the European Union, for all intents and purposes, is a massive entity to deal with. And because of that, they are also very, very strict in their mandates, in their regulations, in all of this sort of stuff. And it becomes a nasty minefield to actually work through because the fines are awful. They are upwards of tens of millions of euros. And I don't know the exchange rate off the top of my head, but that usually winds up to being quite a good chunk of American change that way. So, but GDPR, it's not, it sounds all scary. It's also relatively mundane when you really get down to it, because it's still just ensuring that the data you are, collecting and protecting falls under industry best practices anyway. So it's just another sort of motivator for making sure that gets done. And in case you do not want to deal with GDPR, the simple way is simply don't target citizens of the EU. It obviously will detract from your customer list by some significant margin. But if you don't need to, or if your organization is simply not ready, not mature enough in terms of your size, in terms of what you're doing, and in terms of course, your money, then, it's best to sort of steer clear of that minefield until, maybe you have some more assurance that things can go pretty well on that front. So with that, those are two big mandatory regulatory systems to adhere to. So I'll take a brief little pause for any questions on those fronts. And also I can dig into any other one of these items as well. I'm kind of like bumping around a little bit, and I'll let you guys explore this sort of on your own time if you really want to get into some of these. But ultimately, a lot of these, especially when it comes to the voluntary standards, they have a lot of overlap, a lot of, pretty similar systems there.
Ryan's got a good one here.
Yes.
He put in the chat here, how do you work with hospitals' legal teams? I'm currently working on a data mining project, and the hospital legal team has cautioned us against utilizing UMLS, essentially a compilation of related medical diagnosis codes, despite other research hospitals using it. I'm wondering what their regulatory and compliance consideration or concerns could be. Real quick here, Ryan, can you just elaborate too? I'm not as familiar with UMLS. What does that acronym stand for?
Yes. So it's the Uniform Medical Library System.
Oh, okay. I see. Rather than like using ICD-9 or ICD-10 codes, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's it's the Unified Medical Language System, and so for that, it's like a meta thesaurus. So that way, like if a doctor plugs in diabetes, for example, then other related diagnosis codes would come out. And that way, if you're looking for similar or related diagnoses, you would capture a larger patient pool.
Yeah, and it can help with like care guides and all that kind of stuff. So Um, the interesting. So I mean, I'm not particularly aware of anyone having problems with UMLS over like ICD-10 or anything like that. The data mining, you use the term data mining project. And so there's some elements when it comes to HIPAA that I've seen generally hospitals be considered of. So they'll think of HIPAA in regards to the protected health information and those individual records, maintaining the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of them, right? And making sure that data is being restricted to its explicit permitted uses, right? Depending on like what their that hospital system. I'm not sure if they're or if that hospital is part of a greater hospital system, or if they're government funded or not, which also changes, by the way. If they are government funded, right, which a lot of hospitals are, you also have to think of like CMS, which is another healthcare government regulation and standard, right? But the data mining portion also makes me think about data in aggregate, right? And how it's being leveraged and utilized. So you can have users generate data for you, right? And then you can, from a business intelligence perspective, make an informed decision based on a group of users doing a set of things, right? Even though it may not be individualized. And so what I have seen a lot that's been coming up is hospital systems don't have any, from a HIPAA standpoint, any regulation that requires them to report on or protect any of the like analytics or information that might be generated by their patients that's in a de-identified format or anything like that. But they also are now very considerate of CCPA and GDPR, which are data privacy laws, which the thing is that personally identifiable information is not the same definition in every single jurisdiction, right? And particularly like CCPA, you can actually have it where there's just an aggregate of general pieces of information that they believe can be re-identified, right? Statistically re-identified to then, hey, that all these attributes and patterns are associated to Ryan as a person, right? Or associated to Travis as a person. So I think that it's not necessarily HIPAA that they're concerned about in that regard or in that particular context. That being said, I do have a pretty good pro tip. So a lot of times I will encounter people who need to take a large data set of protected health information and de-identify it, and they don't know to what standards to do that, what processes. And so usually what I like to refer people to is NIST IR 8053, which is the de-identification of personal information. And it has a very specific section in here for what's called the HIPAA safe harbor method for de-identifying data. So this is a very frequent document and reference that I give to a lot of software developers who are working in the space of data mining and de-identification. Cool? Super. Awesome. So that being noted, do we got any other questions or concerns before Mick continues on here?
I'm very concerned you were able to rattle off that NIST standard just offhand like that, man. I'm impressed.
Well, I made a whole NIST database, baby.
Okay, I know, but like, wow, just off the cuff like that. So
this is what I do in my free time. It's unfortunate.
Why we do it live?
Anyways, so continuing on here, Mick. Good start.
All good. So with those big mandatory standards out of the way, I'll just touch on two of these voluntary standards. So I'll go with the big one first, SOC 2. This is a very common one that you see a lot of times, largely because it's essentially, for all intents and purposes, the gold standard for, your compliance standards there. It's actually overseen not even by a cybersecurity organization, but by American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, ACIPA. So, but apparently these guys got it together. They have a very robust set of standards that they call SOC 2, System and Organization Control Level 2. Yes, there's actually a SOC 1 and a SOC 3. Those are kind of referenced at the bottom there, but SOC 2 is more of your security controls and your data processing controls in that regard. So, and SOC 2 is also broken up into two types as well. There's a type 1 and a type 2. Type 1 is kind of the stepping stone on to type 2, but the type 1 is considered the snapshot view of an organization's policies, procedures, data processing, stuff like that. Basically, they take everything from give us everything at once. We'll look at it and we'll determine if you are type 1 compliant. We'll write you an attestation or, make you certified in that regard. But that is what a type 1 looks like. And a type 2 is the more robust version. And that's the thing that everybody's typically getting a type 1 to justify. So your type 2 actually covers a set of time. So it goes over around 6 months is a pretty typical audit period, where whenever you request an audit of your organization, they will take everything that you've collected from the past 6 months and compare it, make sure everything is looking good, making sure everything from your security controls to your security reviews, to any kind of incident, any kind of change management, anything and everything that you have documented and auditable is actually looking good and solid. So the reason you might want to do that is SOC 2, because it is essentially a gold standard, is it is super good for your customer base. If you're doing a lot of B2B business engagements, then that means that they can very much trust you, and that will make you a much more eligible sort of client in case they're down to whether or not the security is going to matter in terms of processing and any risks that your potential client would be facing. The other is that it's also looking very good for just your customers. Hey, if your customer knows what a SOC 2 certification is or attestation is, then hey, you're looking pretty. It's and a lot of large organizations wind up collecting this. Usually, very, very big thing that I have listed here is Google, Amazon, and Microsoft for their Google Cloud, Amazon AWS, and Microsoft Azure. They have a lot of these certifications either publicized or available upon request to give some peace of mind that whatever servers you're renting from them or conducting business through, that those will be secure on those fronts for that. So with all of that, I'm trying to the other side that goes into a SOC 2 is that because it is more robust, it is typically prohibitive for a lot of organizations. Either A, they simply don't have the maturity level for it. If they're starting to build it up, obviously you do not want a SOC 2 right out the gate. And B, it's also quite cost prohibitive as well. Because a typical audit will run you tens of thousands of dollars for a type 2. And that's, not even accounting for anything you need to do on the front end, such as any security tooling that you've implemented, any staffing requirements, any this, that, the other thing that you need to actually set up to be SOC 2 type 2 compliant. So that's usually a much more down the line kind of thing. Or if you've already got a large organization that has a pretty okay security posture that way, usually most people, put that off until absolutely necessary. So, and with that, let's go to a lighter standard then. Let's cut down all the way to the NIST CSF. So I like NIST CSF. It is a very little easygoing kind of guy. It's a pretty good regulatory standard. It's actually not necessarily certifiable in that regard. But because it's voluntary, it at least lets you have some flexibility in your approaches to different things. This CSF is obviously developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's called the Cybersecurity Framework, CSF, that way. It's kind of just been growing over the past almost decade now. It has 3 big components to it. It has your core, which lists essentially everything that's related to your controls, your policies and procedures, how to align, how you actually want to conduct things, the rubber meeting the road kind of thing. The tier actually lets you evaluate and measure your level of maturity within that framework on that front. So, and it also lets you scope whatever you need your initiatives to be moving forward. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of profile on that one. So scoping goes to the profile, and that helps you plan out your initiatives and outcomes for anything moving forward based on your tiers and based on what you've accomplished on the core front. So now there's also five primary functions of the CSF, and it's those are broken down into individual actions within the functions. But if you've been dealing with any NIST CSF stuff, you could probably say the 5 offhand with your eyes closed: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So pretty much every part of a cybersecurity framework. You're identifying your risk, identifying what is important to you, identifying any threats and any incidents as they're occurring, protecting all of your assets as much as possible, detecting if there's any incidents going on, responding appropriately to incidents before, or of course, setting up for anything on the front end, just in case, we saw Log4Shell, a while ago, making sure you can respond to that on the front end before anybody actually, manages to take something over like that. And of course, recover in case, hey, something does hit you and you got to put a Band-Aid on things. So NIST CSF tends to be a pretty good framework to actually kick off a lot of cybersecurity management systems. So if you're starting off and you need some ideas, you need some documentation, guidelines, things like that, that's usually a pretty good way to start off with things on that front. So I'll pick up questions in just a minute, but the next thing I want to jump into is the justifications for all of these compliance standards. As you can see, I've listed, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. I can't even count right now. I've listed quite a bit, and I've not even, touched on everything that is possible that goes with it. So the justifications wind up, becoming scoped based on the kind of businesses you're doing, kind of business you're actually doing, the business operations side, where you're doing it, who you're doing it with, how big your organization is, how much money you've got. All those kind of factors play into the justification of dealing with compliance, your regulatory standards on that front. So especially with the voluntary standards, if you are hopping into, like, say, the ISO 27K series, well, ISO 27K is actually a family of like 60 different, specifications on things. So, do you have a lot of money to throw in at 60 family members? Probably not. And especially you don't need to for all 60 on that. That's where, if you don't have the money for, justification on that front, well, if you look at the ISO family, you could also see we could probably knock off at least 20 things that wouldn't apply to you outright out of hand. So that's how you find your justification for whatever voluntary frameworks you're doing. And of course, within certain realms, you actually have to adhere to certain regulatory standards. If you process any credit card information from the big four, Visa, Discover, MasterCard, and Amex, well, you then have to adhere to PCI DSS standards. So unless you want to, stop processing credit cards on your front, or you want to dish that out to a third party and lose a cut of your profits that way, then, you can justify that whichever way you decide as well. And of course, the big thing that I also like to focus on is customer relationships, because if you are adherent to very strict compliance standards, well, that usually lets people sleep pretty well at night, giving you their social security number, their blood type, and whatever else they decide to hand you anyway. So before I move on to strictness, I will take any questions. Now I see we got Ryan asking a question right here. Common compliance standards that apply to critical infrastructure such as power grids, oil, gas, or operations. Ooh, that's very good. So, I'll zoom back in on this one. So, when I did an internship with a SOC, they were very big on this relatively new standard called CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. This is actually really new. This officially, I think, came into practice in 2020, I believe it was. But this is the standard for contracting with the DoD. So this is the big deal. And it's actually, we're still in sort of a grace period for that. But a big part of dealing with these, with the DoD is actually dealing with the critical infrastructure. Under the CUI, the controlled unclassified information there, it actually lists the sort of libraries and references that one would actually have to adhere to if they're contracting with the DoD on that front. A lot of that is your critical infrastructure, your oil pipelines, your energy pipelines, all that sort of stuff actually goes into that. So depending on to what degree you're actually dealing with that infrastructure, you might be dealing with CMMC compliance on that front. So
I got a little bit to add to that. So
Absolutely.
while CMMC is a good point there, and I would say is important to keep in mind, one of the things that's just generally important, especially when it comes to, so Ryan, anything that is like utility infrastructure that's particularly generating electricity. The only reason why I happen to know about this is because I work for a couple of solar companies and a couple of years back. So there's the NERC standards, right? And the NERC CIP standards in particular are around the cybersecurity infrastructure requirements. So there are like, I think it's NERC CIP 2. Let me just pull it up here. That one would want to be considered of in particular when we talk about infrastructure. I also know that there's more bills that have been recently been discussed and are in some level of being passed when it comes to additional requirements for utility providers and infrastructure providers, most particularly in the United States here. So yeah, so right here, NERC standard CIP 002-4 through CIP-0094 are for the cybersecurity framework for electrical bulk electrical delivery systems. So this is something that I do not work with on a daily basis, but I have touched enough to be dangerous with. Travis, I am interested in regards to your general background working with the United States Army. Is there any other things that you might be generally aware of from like a critical utility infrastructure standpoint that might apply here?
From a compliance standpoint, no, but a lot of those organizations will also adhere to DoD 8570, just put in the chat. Well, that is the DoD's version of it. The other government organizations have their own versions, and that's a baseline of certifications that you actually need to be able to work in those roles as a government contractor or as a government employee. So I posted that link on there. You can kind of go see based on which section of InfoSec you're interested in. But the bottom line is, if you want to work for or with the government in information security, you're best off going and getting the CompTIA Security Plus certification. It's the easiest way to check a lot of those boxes that they will require. So that's actually why you'll see a lot of those positions either say Security Plus required, or you're required to get one within the first 6 months of being hired on. That is their grace period under this baseline.
That's a pretty cool pro tip there. And then continuing on here, has GoVanguard ever pen tested these areas before? Yes. So I've done pen testing against some solar power electric companies, as well as like some locomotive companies and transport providers, that kind of stuff. So that's a really interesting domain to pen test, because it is not it's similar to IoT, but not quite the same. So you deal with what are called a lot of industrial control systems and SCADA systems, right? And SCADA, you can think of it as the kind of older school version of IoT. Just as like a very brief example, a lot of folks have probably heard about, at least in passing, positive train control, right? Particularly around like when Amtrak has another train that flips over or something like that, and everyone's trying to understand why that happened and why there's no automation systems. It's because they're supposed to implement positive train control years and years ago, right? But anyways, positive train control has like a requirement to have cameras within like the cabin, right, with the engineers and all that kind of stuff. But hilariously enough, when you go to pen test a lot of these locomotives and that kind of stuff, because it is infrastructure, right, a lot of those cameras have default passwords, all that kind of stuff. A lot of these industrial control systems and SCADA systems, that they're essentially accessible usually through a serial controller, right, that's then connected to a network, and you can interface with it via Telnet, right, with default credentials, or there is no authentication mechanism in place. Anything that's on that same local subnet can essentially just get to that IP address and Telnet to it, and then start issuing a set of commands. So it is a particularly quirky area, especially because there are still tons and tons of systems that exist out there that are Windows XP and that are not going to go anywhere for the next, probably 10, 15 years, unfortunately.
I was going to say, I remember back in my Security Plus studying days, like they were talking about how SCADA is actually, it's a pain in the ass to actually update anything. So, so that makes it a pretty big target on those fronts. And not just the fact that it's obviously connected to the critical infrastructure on that front. So Travis, did you have something you were going to add?
No, I agree with
No,
you.
gotcha. So,
It's one of those things where they bought something 20 years ago and it still works, whether it's like an industrial air conditioner or something like that. And it's going to be a hard sell for somebody to get their, the operations guy to replace an air conditioner that's working just because it's end of life and not getting software updates anymore. So yeah, it is a huge target. It can be a big deal, and as it can be a real hassle.
Yeah. So, well, so pick it back up on this. I'm going to kind of speed run through the rest of this because I've already touched on this little section above what I've got focused on right here. Strictness. Different standards are quite strict depending on what you're looking at, but strictness has its pros and cons. One, being strict means you're having a very good posture, but it usually winds up coming with a hefty price tag and a lot of effort on your end in terms of manpower, in terms of actual getting tooling set up, all sorts of things that go into that. So strictness, you may want to go lenient at first, obviously if you can't afford to go stricter, that's a big factor as well. But that's all kind of goes into that, and it will depend on sort of whatever regulatory standard you're adhering to. So GDPR is going to be a lot stricter in a lot more senses than some of the other things that I've touched on there. So when it comes to actually determining compliance, well, there's a couple different routes one can take. An organization can actually do an internal audit where they basically pull together some of their team and say, hey, look at our systems and compare them to this standard for whatever reason. Are we looking good? You can do an internal audit that way. However, there is a slight flaw. While, again, it might save you some money because you're essentially pulling in all of your internal folks who you're already paying anyway. A slight flaw is that you actually may have some biased views that go into the determining of your compliance. So while and also, any sort of lack of understanding, for lack of a better term, in the nuances of some of these systems, while it might look like you actually did not adhere to something, you might actually adhere to the standard perfectly fine as long as it's an addressable system that way. Or you might also overlook something that actually you might think is fine, but turns out is not. So internal audit has a pro and con list that way. And of course, there's an external audit, which as you do with any sort of third-party entity, you're going to get whatever money you can get, whatever money is going to get you, right? So you can run the gamut. You can go for a very cheap little third party group and they might write you the best looking letter in the world. But as we've experienced earlier this year, we were doing a SOC 2 gap assessment. And while they were looking very good on a type 1 front, type 2 was actually not as good. We were looking over everything. We're like, actually, these guys shouldn't have even been type 1. So that runs the gamut of, what you can actually get in terms of value that way. So determining compliance is very tricky dealing. And of course, again, that's where the money comes in because you have people interpreting these massive tomes of nonsense. But a good way to actually help around that is, especially lately, automated tooling has been introduced and developed. So we've been working with a couple different tools, playing things out. A very cool one that we've been seeing is something called Drata. It actually, we're not affiliated with Drata in any real capacity that way, but it actually connects to a lot of these systems. So if you have a Microsoft Azure system, it can actually run automated scripts that will go through your system and determine, okay, these are actually in compliance with certain levels on that front, as well as also evaluating potential existence of your policies and procedures that way and determining compliance on that front. There's also a couple of other ones. Microsoft actually has its own for Compliance Center in case you have a nice little Microsoft subscription on that front. But the big flaw of coming with that is that unfortunately, automation is not a perfect system. It might throw in some false positives. It might throw in some false negatives. It might actually not give you a full proper scoping of what is actually needed for compliance, but it's a developing system. It's not something to necessarily throw out the window just yet. So but that's one method of actually determining compliance. That's something that's, being more developed and getting more robust as time goes on there. So
I was about to say, what the hell is up with you updating your LinkedIn that says Drata Sales Associate on it? I was like, what?
that update was supposed to go a little bit later. So I told you automation is flawed. So anyway.
So fantastic. So a really important, just kind of addendum note to that is that as you guys are leveraging tools, right? Just like when it comes to pen testing, by the way, right? Compliance should be the same as you're analyzing the security posture of an environment, leveraging various white box tools, be it if it's Microsoft Compliance Center and Security Center, Drata, some other fantastic tools. Don't ever trust one singular tool, right, to do your job. Also, a lot of times we'll see an organization, they'll purchase a great tool. Like you could purchase Drata or something like that, but you need to still have a plan for implementing it appropriately. Someone needs to own that system, right? And then you're going to have to still do maintenance processes, right? And keeping it clean and up to date, right? Because a lot of times organizations, when they see a tool, they're like, oh, this tool has been marketed to solve all my problems and I can just set it and forget it. And that's not quite the case. Even the best automation solutions that exist out there, just still at the end of the day, don't have the understanding that a human being can formulate, most particularly around a defense in depth approach, right? So, for example, you could have Microsoft Compliance Center say, oh, hey, you don't have ACLs here on your virtual machines, right? And your virtual machines are exposed, when in reality, it's like, well, that's because we actually deployed a Palo Alto virtual firewall in Azure, right? And we're not leveraging the Azure native ACLs, right? So a lot of solutions may not have, again, that nuanced context to the defense in depth approach that might be applied to an organization. Continue, Mick.
Yeah. So, and I'm just going to give a little brief example of a tool system that, we use. There's nothing more than us compliance guys love than a good old, is it sharing? Can y'all see my nasty spreadsheet here?
Oh, this seems like another great thing I can convert to a Notion database.
I'm ahead of you on that one, buddy. So I told you, I showed you what I was doing with this earlier. So I can actually show this off in just a moment.
Growth mindset.
Hell yeah. So this is a typical checklist that we kind of use for HIPAA gap assessments. We can kind of see how it's laid out. I did not develop this. This was developed by another one of our great team members, Mr. Connor. But all this does is it actually aligns specific rules from the security rules, or the specific sections of the security, privacy, and breach rules to specific actions to be audited. And what we wind up doing is, when you're looking at these sort of audit criteria, well, one, you associate whether or not it's actually something relevant. So if you have, everything that a covered entity needs to be, be compliant with, so does a BA, but it's not a one-to-one relationship, because not everything that a BA does, or not everything that a business associate does, has to adhere to the same rules as the covered entity. If it's clear as mud, you totally got it. So basically, a good way to minimize this is, if it's privacy rule, it's largely a covered entity. If it's everything else, it is basically both. So that's how you can break things down that way. And then we have a little maturity level for compliance, or actually maturity level for compliance. If they're 100%, hey, they're looking very good. If they're, say, 60%, they're doing some things right, but it's not fully there. Well, that's there. But you can still be technically compliant and still be 60% mature. So that's where everything goes in. Usually the maturity level associates to industry best practices on that front. And to help with the audit process in terms of generating a report, it's good to actually list out systems and documents that are in place. So if you've got all of their information security policies, hey, you can reference those here. If you know they're using AWS and you're verifying that GuardDuty is up and running, it looks really good, well, you can reference the fact that they've got GuardDuty up and running on that front. So this allows you to provide evidentiary material so that you can have that on hand. The reason you want to have it on hand is because HIPAA is actually not a proactive compliance level. It's more of a reactive compliance thing, where the Department of Human Services, they actually don't care until you've had a breach. Then that's when they send the auditors to come in and start messing with all of your stuff. And at which case, it's up to you to provide the evidence that you are actually doing what you should have been doing. So you can actually be operating completely fine for 15 years, actually be out of compliance with HIPAA, but the moment you are breached, well, that's when everything gets really nasty. That's when the fines start adding up. And that's when everything gets really, really gross, especially if you don't have the evidence to back up, the good things that you've been doing. So sometimes the tools, if the automation doesn't work, you can go simple and go dirty with our little spreadsheets over here. But I'm going to pop back over to our Notion page here and get into wrapping up everything that we'll be talking about tonight in our putting it all together section. So this whole presentation, these two presentations only scratch the surface of everything, because again, I could go on for hours and hours and hours and hours. You guys don't want that. I especially don't want that. I'm already losing my voice as it is, right? So this is all just to provide a high level things. And, depending on where things go, I might break into some of these compliance standards a little bit more in depth on later meetings there. But I wanted to give you guys sort of like a visual representation of where I see actually GRC actually folding into the cybersecurity landscape. So if we look at our little bar here, we have sort of a general spectrum of red to blue team, very common, understood methodologies for cybersecurity. With all of you see on the red team, we have our offensive security, and blue team being our defensive guys. I kind of fit these guys. These are obviously not to scale, sort of where I think they would align on this list, because governance is more of a blue team practice. Obviously, you've got to develop the policies and procedures in manner that makes sense with all of your organization structure, infrastructure, what you guys can do as a business. But, falls a little bit into the red team, because part of your governance can be, hey, we need to actually engage some of these red team incidents and, bring us into the organization that way. And risk kind of falls into a more purple team, because you almost have to have a mind of, a malicious actor to understand, actually, is this a relevant risk? Yes, you can view things from a business operations perspective, but also you can look at things like, where's our weakest link here? If you think more in the mind of an attacker, you could actually be more set up for a defensive position in the first place. But compliance gets to be a tricky deal, because it's almost the overall justification for everything. So I decided, hey, make it swallow everything up, and compliance surrounds everything that gets happening there, because your compliance can also dictate if red teaming needs to occur, if what level of blue teaming needs to occur. It determines all of that sort of stuff. So it becomes a sort of overarching entity on that front. So what I've done here in this page as well, I will not break this in because we're only got a few minutes left and I want to answer any questions that might come up. I've thrown in my perspective on sort of what things should, my perspective on working in compliance on that front, sort of where I've come from in a very, very, very brief sense, and sort of why I think it's actually been a very good position within this field, and why I think, I'll probably continue with this moving forward. I've also thrown in some suggested traits for anybody who's interested in GRC, in case, some things you might want to know when you be, privy to, and of course, whatever your personality types might align to it. I have a sort of high level view of things. I'm not a very detail oriented person, but that allows my cohort, my manager, to actually, who is very detail oriented. It allows us to actually see things from very good perspectives and allows us to get things done, very different ways. But, having that sort of flexibility, that's a big trait that I throw into that list. Again, I'll let you guys review that on your own. But, I'll keep this for very brief on the other end here. Would I recommend it? Yeah. Hell yeah. That's terrible. Why did it scroll so poorly? I'm so upset about that. Technical difficulties, man.
I love the mix of memes that you've been putting in here. The Big Lebowski reference in the beginning really kicked it off to a good start, man.
I'm so glad.
I just want to check any other big elements you got left here before I just sprinkle in just a couple little tidbits on the top here.
No, I'm actually going to stop sharing right now.
Okay. So first and foremost, I got one note, about some home self-defense stuff, right? And Ryan posting about it and talking about it with IoT. I want to hit on that at the end because I'm really ecstatic about that particular topic, right? But I just want to share out my screen for a couple additional references for you guys here. So on our Enclave site, there's a ton of materials and references in the domain of governance, risk, and compliance, obviously pen testing as well, and all that kind of fun jazz. But the state breach notification laws we're tracking for, right? All those NIST 800 and 1800 technical series publication database. We have our general InfoSec encyclopedia, but something that's pretty cool if someone is interested in pursuing a GRC analyst path, right? So Blake and myself, we built out for our team these growth plans, right? And one of the things that we did for these growth plan for our team was we had some skill trees that we created, right? And if we just open up this like image real quick in a new tab, we can zoom right in, and that provides just a kind of a little bit of like, by the way, this is not for everybody. This is what we did for our GRC analysts and our GRC team, right? So it's going to apply differently for different types of organizations and where they focus their time and energy. But if you guys want to gain just a little bit of additional insight and trying to build a career path for it, likely this will be something that at least will help you get started. And you'll see that there's this element of where we started kind of transition this to also understanding how to automate, right, more components of governance, risk, and compliance, right? Because one of the things that we're big proponents of is DevSecOps here. I'm sure that some of you folks may have heard of things like infrastructure as code, right? And then the concept of doing security as code. Well, you want to know what gets really, really cool? Compliance as code, right? And that's where we want to take the rest of our GRC team and that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to make a brief note about that. Again, tons of fantastic content on the Enclave site. So that being noted, I want to take one quick tangent here about something I posted late last night and Ryan replied to, and I'm just so intrigued. So I had it a couple months ago. Someone tried breaking into my house and kicking down my door and that kind of stuff. It was a drunk guy in the middle of the night, pissed off at somebody that had the wrong house. But anyways, so I wrote this whole guide about getting started for home self-defense and how to think about it, and setting up sensors and thinking about the coverage and the landscaping, having a plan and all that kind of stuff, right? And a little bit later, Ryan Johnson here, he posted talking about the considerations around IoT security, right, in someone's house, right? And it makes sense because when we talk about like security, first thing people comes to mind is like having a security system and cameras and door sensors and window sensors, all that, right? And so very, very important, good point. And I want to talk more about IoT pen testing a little bit later. But if I was going to break into somebody's house, hypothetically, I don't break into people's houses. I've done a lot of physical pen testing for businesses in the past, but it's really something interesting that people take for granted. And this is why I believe security systems, regular home security systems, are not some type of silver bullet, is because they use these little door sensors and window sensors that when a door gets open or a window gets open, it sends a transmission, right, over radio frequencies, right? Usually it'd be like 433 megahertz, right? Back to some home IoT hub, right? That says, hey, this sensor state has changed. The sensor has opened, by the way, just so you know, right? And then you can get a notification. Hey, window was just opened or door was just open. This is anomalous activity, set off an alarm or whatever. But classic technique, right, for malicious actors who want to take things to the next level, especially if you're breaking into a business, is using something like a software-defined radio, like what we have here with the Yardstick 1, which is a sub 1 gigahertz frequency SDR. Well, so what can you do? Well, what you could do as a malicious actor is when you get close to somebody's door or window, before you go to open it, is you spread across all the channels over the 433 megahertz spectrum, right? Tons and tons of interference. So it jams the communication for when that door sensor goes and breaks up from the magnet and it goes to send out a little notification over radio frequency airways. Well, the thing is the hub can never detect that because there's so much interference and noise. So it doesn't know that the door was opened, right? So that is a practical example of sometimes when we're as homeowners or consumers sold a security solution, right? Or even as business owners, we're sold a security solution, right? It's not necessarily perfect out of the box, right? And a silver bullet on itself. And why even when it comes to home security and the physical security of your business and the protection of information for your business, having and practicing a defense in depth approach, right? So you should never rely on just those little door or window sensors in themselves to tell you that there's a bad guy in the home or that broke into your business, that kind of stuff. So I thought I would just kind of nerd out there for a moment, talk a little bit about IoT pen testing and devices like that kind of stuff. So That being noted, 12 gauge is pretty low tech. I love it. Team, any last big questions or concerns or anything like that before we jump off?
So everyone's aware we are not meeting next week. It's the day before Thanksgiving. So next week there will not be a session. We'll post about that on all of our pages as well.
Cool. So we'll have to make some really good Thanksgiving memes that are cybersecurity related to make up for it.
Of course.
So, okay, then it looks like we've covered all the big items for everyone here. As always, team, thank you for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. We'll get this posted up to YouTube shortly, and let's stay connected. Have a great night now. Bye.
Take care.
Thanks, y'all.